Today we are going to talk about one of the best-known articles in ethics in the past 40 years, and that is, or I guess more like 50 years now, and that is Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality. So there's a way to sort of extend. So in this section of the class, we're going to kind of be bouncing around from issue to issue, but there is a kind of connective tissue between Singer's article for today and the Rachel's article that we read last week. Remember, in Rachel's article, he proposed that there is no moral difference between killing and letting die. That if we are in a situation where we are just letting someone die, or letting nature take its course, then it would be it is just as moral to kill that person. Right, that we might put that person out of his or her misery. Right. The converse of that is that, well, if we can do something, then we should not let the person die at all. Right. So consider this. We consider this moral collapse that Rachel's proposes between the difference between killing and letting die, and we take that outside the hospital setting. We get some strange results, right? So I want to point out that Rachel's, of course, is a utilitarian. So the emphasis in his article was on suffering as being the most important factor in deciding what correct action is. Singer is also a utilitarian. And he is going to use a lot of the same premises as Rachel's, and reach some actually similar conclusions. So instead of talking about euthanasia or talking about what a doctor's moral obligations are to a patient, Singer is thinking about the obligations of people in an affluent country like the United States to people around the world. We all know that we know now better than ever, even better than back in 1971 when Singer wrote this. We are aware that we're part of a world community, and that there are large swaths of this world community that are suffering from terrible poverty, from curable diseases. From hunger, they are suffering terrible situations, suffering an extraordinary amount, even unto death, and that the money that we have here in, say, the United States can be sent to alleviate some of that suffering, right? And our attitude towards people who here in America who do give to save the children or do give to a certain charity, our attitude is that that person is doing something morally good over and above what is necessary, right? In other words, it is not morally wrong to not give to charity. That's why they call it charity, right? So Singer is going to ask that we rethink this distinction between charity and moral duty. And as always, his methodology is just as important, if not more important, than his conclusion. So, okay. So at this point in class, I usually ask if anybody's heard the name Kitty Genovese. Anyone? No? Okay, well, I have some, this is a pretty harrowing story. So thus begins the awful but true story, the sad story of Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was a 27-year-old bartender who lived in Queens, New York. This was back in 1966, I believe. She's a bartender. She works very late at night, so she's coming home one night about 3 a.m. And on the street outside of her apartment building, she's ambushed by, as it turns out, a local serial killer named Winston Moseley, I believe. She's ambushed by the serial killer. and he attacks her with a knife. Kitty screams for help. She says, help me, he's stabbing me, he's killing me, help me, right? And in that ruckus, somebody leans out of a window above where the attack is taking place and yells, leave that girl alone, right? The serial killer, Mosley, shocked by this, runs down to the end of the street, right? Kitty is seriously injured. She stumbles to get away. She stumbles down the street in the opposite direction and goes around the side of the building at the end of the block, the side of her apartment building at the end of the block. Mosley, a few minutes later, realizes that nobody is really going to do anything. The window that somebody shouted out of closed. So Mosley goes back down to the entranceway to Kitty's apartment building. She has and then ambushes her as she tries to enter the building, right? And he finishes her off, right? Now, this whole time she's screaming for help, and this whole time nobody. There are a considerable amount of people of her neighbors who hear her screaming. Nobody who hears her screaming apparently does anything to help her or even call the police. Now, the initial reporting on this case is that as many as 36 of Kitty's neighbors heard her screaming, knew they could do something, but didn't even call the police. That number in this story has come under some scrutiny in the past 10 years or so. Some people in the period of sort of fact-checking this in the past 10 years, some of the Kitty's neighbors have spoken up for themselves and say, actually, I did call the police, but the police don't come to that neighborhood. And that's gone on recently has actually, it's called into question that 36 of her neighbors did nothing number, but it has confirmed that there were a good number of people who heard Kitty screaming for her life, who knew they could do something, for instance, call the police, and if you get disconnected or they don't hear you or they don't want to come, call them back and keep at it, right? There were a good number of people who even later testified at Mosley's trial, he was caught later on, that they helped, but they did nothing, right? And the reporting of this back in 1966 causes a sort of national and international scandal, right? It makes headlines all around the world, and it causes a lot of soul searching here in the United States, because a lot of people, particularly New Yorkers, think, is this what we've come to? We've come to a situation where we are so indifferent, so inured to the suffering of other people, that when we know we can help, we just don't want to get involved. It's just not my problem. You're going to die, too bad. That's your thing, right? And some people think that, for all the good that Kitty's neighbors did her, well, her off. Notice in that story there were two attacks. There was the initial attack, then Mosley backed off, and then about half an hour later he found her again and finished her off. And it's been established that she would have survived that first attack if she would have gotten medical attention. So if the police had been called and paramedics had arrived, then she would have survived. Instead, nobody did anything, and Mosley had the opportunity to come back and finish her off. Right. So, hey, maybe those indifferent neighbors, even though they're not serial killers, they're not deranged, they're not outwardly bad people. Maybe the truth is that in their own way, they're just as bad as the guy who killed her. Right. If you turn a blind eye to human suffering, when you can help somebody in a life and death situation without sacrificing anything important to you, but you do nothing instead, then maybe you're your own kind of evil, right? And maybe that kind of evil is, in its way, just as bad as somebody who actually goes around killing people. I reached back to 1966 for the Kitty Genovese case because it's probably the most famous case of this kind of thing, but you hear about a case like this every few years now, right? particularly in the age of people having on their phones. Time and again, every few months now, we hear about a case where somebody could have helped another person, but instead they just got out their camera and filmed it, right? There was a case a few years ago of some kids in Florida who videotaped a man drowning. Rather than calling help, rather than reaching a branch out to him, he was drowning in a lake, and they just filmed it, right? And that seems sick, seriously morally wrong, maybe as wrong as murder. Another case about 10 years ago in Richmond, California, after a high school dance, some young men began to gang rape a young woman, and the dance lets out, and they're doing their thing, and it's violent. It's there's no doubt that this is an attack, and the kids walking out of dance, even though they all have their little phones now, not my problem. Not my problem. Eventually, 45 minutes later, somebody, after the girl has been not just raped but very seriously injured, somebody mentions to their parents that was happening, and then a parent calls the police, right? And again, we enter into the soul searching, how we got to this point where we are so indifferent to the suffering of other human beings, where we're so afraid to get involved, where we're so kind of concerned only about our own well-being that we just ignore the ways that we might be able to help others, right? So Singer thinks that these kinds of cases are what he's going to talk about. That's where he's going to begin. But he introduces not with a historical case like any of this, but rather with a thought experiment, right? A thought experiment that hits on these same intuitions. He says, imagine this. Imagine you were walking by a lake, and you see an infant face down in the water, kind of struggling to get out of the water, right? The baby is drowning, and it will drown shortly, right? Now, let's say that you just say, you know what, I could wade in and pull the baby out of the water, right? It's just you just have to wade a few feet in. You don't have to fight off any crocodiles or swim through any rapids. You just have to wade in up to your knees, pull the baby out, right? I could do that, but you know what, I'm not going to. And you just turn around and you walk away and the baby drowns, right? Now, you did not drown the baby. You did not put the baby in the water. You are not the baby's parent, so you don't have any special sort of relationship with the child. Even so, it seems to most people that if you just do nothing, if you turn around and walk away from the baby and just let the baby drown, you have, through inaction, done something seriously morally wrong. That is, that you have done something, by doing nothing, you have actually done something that's morally terrible, right? And so Singer wants to start here. He says, so if we think that if we have an intuition that we have a positive moral obligation to help the drowning baby, then we can extract from that a moral principle and call this Singer's principle. Singer's principle says if you can keep something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything important, then you ought to do it, right? And Singer takes it that this principle will explain. He doesn't mention Kitty Genovese, but I take it he knew about it. So I take it that he thinks that this principle would also cover why it's wrong not to call the police for Kitty Genovese. Later on, why it's wrong not to call the police for the girl who was raped in Richmond, Virginia, and why it's not wrong to help in all of those other cases, like the case where the guy is drowning and the children just film it, right? Now, Singer gives two different versions of this principle. This first version we'll call the moderate principle. This is the moderate version of this principle. And there needs to be another version of this principle because Singer thinks that we're not quite this isn't quite tight enough because there's a loophole here. Imagine that I'm walking by the drowning baby, right? And I see the drowning baby, and I could go in to help the baby. But the truth is, I just bought this new pair of very expensive leather pants, right? These pants are awesome. They're really nice looking on. They look great on me. Everybody says so. The only problem with them is these are not the leather pants. These are mine. But just imagine that, right? Imagine me in leather pants. Leather pants, if you ever had them, you know that they take a while to sort of get on and off. I mean, once they're on, they look fantastic, right? But I'm walking along out in the forest, just play along, in my hot leather pants, right? I see this drowning baby, and I think to myself, well, I could wade in to save that drowning baby. But I'm wearing my pants. And you know about water and leather, right? I mean, if I wade in and get them all muddy and wet, it's going to ruin these awesome, expensive leather pants. I mean, yes, I could take them off, but that takes a while and maybe takes a friend, right? So by then, the baby's going to be drowned anyway, right? So better to just not get involved. And I just turn around and I walk away because I don't want to ruin my pants, right? Now, Singer takes it that there's a loophole here because so the first version of the principle says if you can keep something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything important, then you ought to do it. Well, me and my leather pants, I can say, well, yeah, I follow this principle, but it says without sacrificing anything important. And I mean, if you don't think these leather pants are important, you didn't see what I paid for them, and also you probably haven't seen me in them because awesome, right? Now, obviously, this defies common sense. The truth of the matter is, I don't care how good you look in your pants or how expensive they are. No reasonable person would say that leather pants are important in the way that a human life is important. So Singer thinks that we should shore this up a little bit to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So instead, we can say, if you can keep something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable importance, then you ought to do it. And that will be the strong version of this principle. Okay, so if you can keep something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable importance, then you ought to do it, right? Even if my leather pants are important, no reasonable person thinks that they are comparable in importance to a human life. This will be the stronger version of Singer's principle. And this spells out a little more the limits of this principle, too. I mean, on the other hand, if to save the drowning baby, it requires that I put my own life at risk or the life of somebody else at risk. Let's say I do have to fight off a crocodile to save the baby. Well, then I'm putting my own life at risk, and that's of comparable importance to the baby. So then it would be reasonable to say, well, you know what, I'd like to save that baby, but I'm not going to take on that crocodile. That would be perfectly acceptable under this principle, right? Same thing if you had to put your family's life at stake to help the baby or something like that, right? So Singer takes it that this principle is very intuitively acceptable. It shores with our common sense. It plays well with our intuitions about the drowning baby and about Kitty Genovese, and in fact explains those intuitions. Right? He thinks that generally speaking, everybody should accept this principle. And in fact, everybody does, he thinks, accept this principle. We are all appalled by the person who walks away from the drowning baby. Right? You accept this principle? I mean, it seems harmless enough, but it's a trap. So let's talk about what Singer does with this principle. Okay, so before we go any further, the attendance password for today is flower. Flower. like the pretty thing that grows out of the ground. So, okay, so Singer says we all intuitively accept his principle, but he thinks we don't apply it very well. For example, there's no baby drowning before your eyes right now. I hope, right? If there is, pause this video and save the baby, right? But we all know that there are places all over the world, Syrian refugee camps, for instance, throughout various parts of the Middle East, in war zones like Libya or Oman, right? There are all sorts of hotspots, problem places around the world where we know children are dying today. We know that they are going to not make it through the end of the week because they don't have a way to get out, or they don't have enough food, or they're dying of curable diseases, right? There are places throughout Africa, very poor places, where a $20 mosquito net makes the difference between a child living to adulthood and not living to adulthood, because mosquitoes spread diseases like malaria that are particularly awful, or particularly deadly to children, right? And there are lots of kids in those places that are going to die for want of a $20 mosquito net that anybody can go down to Home Depot here in the United States and buy, right? So we know that there are all sorts, scores and scores, millions of children in very serious need in various places around the world. We have the means to help them, Singer thinks. The means to help them is to donate to charitable organizations like Red Cross and Oxfam and Save the Children and so on, right? And yet, most of us don't. And Singer thinks, furthermore, not only do most of us don't, but when we do hear somebody has donated to Save the Children, we think, oh, well, that's good. That person's gone above and beyond what is normally expected of a person, right? That person is morally good. And Singer thinks that this is actually a lazy, if not perverse, way of viewing our moral obligations to our fellow human beings, right? He thinks that if we all agree that we should save a baby that's drowning before your eyes, you have exactly the same moral duties to help save a child who is going to die this week in a Syrian refugee camp or in a Haitian orphanage or something like that. You have exactly the same moral obligations for exactly the same reasons, right? The difference is that saving the drowning baby just involves going in and physically turning the baby over and bringing the baby to land. Saving children around the world requires going to these charitable organizations and giving up potentially your hard-earned money. But Singer thinks, well, but that doesn't make any difference, because in the same way we all agree that the person who prefers his hot leather pants to a child's life is sick in the head, Singer thinks, well, you ought to be just as judgmental of somebody who prefers to, could spend a few $100s to save the life of a child this week, but instead goes out and buys a new PlayStation or a new laptop or school books or any of these other things that we could get on and live without, but we don't. And Singer thinks, well, the truth is, we here in affluent countries like the United States, we are all the people who walk away from the drowning baby. We do it every day whenever we spend our money on a lot of disposable distractions that we don't really need. Money that could be sent around the world to save human lives, save the lives of children. We judge very harshly the person who walks away from the drowning baby, but what we don't realize is that we're making the very same kinds of decisions, the very same indefensible kind of decision about life and death every day whenever we spend our money on frivolous bullshit rather than on saving human lives, So, in a nutshell, Singer's point is that if we have a duty to save the drowning baby, why don't we have the same duty to save children who are dying of poverty, diseases, etc. around the world? And Singer's answer to this question is, we do. We have exactly the same moral duty for exactly the same reasons to the children around the world. And he next begins to go down a checklist of excuses that he thinks won't work, right? To dodge this duty. First and foremost, he says, well, right off the bat, we should understand that, of course, we're going to have a different emotional reaction to a baby drowning before our eyes than we would to these children that we don't see, we don't know, whose names we're never going to learn, whose eyes we're never going to look into, dying on the other side of the planet, right? The baby before our eyes is very concrete. It's right there. We can literally put our hands on it. The child who's going to die who's going to starve to death next week in a Syrian refugee camp, that's very abstract. It maybe exists in theory or in principle, but it's not something that confronts us, not something we can put our hands on, right? Now, this is a real psychological situation. This is a real psychological phenomenon we're dealing with here, something that happens before our eyes. As it affects us emotionally and gets us moving in the way that something that doesn't happen before our eyes doesn't, right? But Singer says, well, but this isn't really dying before our eyes and dying over the horizon is not really a moral issue. Let's say instead of drowning in front of your eyes, the baby is drowning in a pond on the other side of a hill, and somebody tells you about it. Do you think to yourself, well, yeah, it'd be nice if somebody did something for that baby, but it's not going to be me? No, you think you run to the other side of the hill, pull that baby out of the water, right? So distance isn't really a moral concept here. That we have the same kind of duty to the baby drowning before our eyes still than we do to the baby who's not drowning before our eyes, but drowning in some undisclosed location. So even though it affects us emotionally differently, Singer says that in itself isn't really a significant moral distinction there. So, okay, so there are a few other issues, a few other ways to try to sidestep Singer's conclusion here. One is the idea of the, you might call the fair share argument, right? Somebody might say, okay, well, look, Singer, yes, we collectively have a moral duty to help the children who are dying in places around the world. But you know what? If everybody did their fair share, if everybody pitched in and gave just $20 to help the children, then poverty would be, and all these other problems would be eliminated. So I will give my fair share, which is $20, right, and sign that up, take it off to a far off land, right? So to this, Singer's response is, well, no, I mean, you know that just by common sense, you know that not everybody is going to be giving $20. It would be great if everybody did. Then the argument would be reasonable. But since we know that not everybody is going to be giving $20, in fact, the vast, vast, vast majority of people will be giving nothing, then Singer thinks that we have a moral obligation to be giving as much as we can. Once we understand the contours of this argument and the way that this issue is set up, those of us who are in the know then have a moral obligation to do absolutely as much as we can. In the same way, I mean, if you're standing there on the beach and the baby is drowning in front of your eyes, but instead of just you standing on the beach, there are a bunch of other people standing around you and they're not doing anything. And then you say, well, if they're not going to do anything, I'm not going to do anything. They're not going to do anything heroic. I'm not going to do anything heroic. then the baby drowns. Does that mean that you are not responsible for the baby drowning? Well, no. It just means that there are also, in addition to you being responsible, there are also other people who could have done something, and they have blood on their hands too. And this is, again, another very real psychological phenomenon, by the way. It's called the bystander effect, or diffusion of responsibility, if you've taken a psychology class. And these theories got a lot of ink after the Kitty Genovese incident. So it's well established that if there's a crowd of people who see something bad happening, and they look around, and somebody's calling for help, for instance, and they kind of look around and nobody else is doing anything, then it becomes normal to do nothing, right? This is why if you ever take any kind of class in an emergency prevention or a rape prevention class or anything like that, you're told, don't just yell, "Help me, help me." Look to a crowd of people, look one person in the eye and say, "Help me," because then that cuts through the diffusion of responsibility. It makes one person then feel responsible to help, right? So nonetheless, this is not a moral excuse. This might be a real psychological phenomenon, but it's not a moral excuse. It's if you end up standing there doing nothing while somebody dies from some preventable tragedy. This issue does raise the question of how much Singer thinks that we in affluent countries should be giving to help save the children around the world, right? And Singer's answer to this question is to borrow a phrase from economics, and he says that we all should be giving to what he calls the point of marginal utility. And what is that? Well, good question. So, how much should we be giving to help people in affluent or in distressed countries around the world? Well, Singer's conclusion is that we in affluent countries should be giving to the point of what he calls marginal utility. This is the point at which, by giving any more, we would be as poor or miserable as the people we're helping. So we should give to the point that we are just a little bit better off than the people that we are trying to help, right? And Singer thinks that this requires we in the affluent countries working as hard as we would work to get things for ourselves or to get things for our own families, and continue to work 70, 80 hours a week if you can. Make absolutely as much money as you can, but at the end of the week, don't spend that on a lot of luxuries for yourself. Don't blow that on going out to eat or buying a new car. Package that money up and give it to a charity to help people who are worse off than you. Don't buy a house if a small apartment would do. Don't get a big apartment even if a more economical apartment would do. Live in a small apartment, work as hard as you can, package up all your money, all your extra cash, and donate it to charity, right? Now, a couple of questions come up at this point. Can anybody really do this, right? More to the point, what kind of lifestyle does Peter Singer have? Does he sacrifice all of his money to help people, strangers around the world? Well, this is an example. So the question, to respond to Singer's argument by asking, well, how do you live your life, buddy? Is an example of what we in philosophy or in logic call an ad hominem argument, right? This is where you reply not to somebody's argument, but rather you just ask questions about the person, right? You respond to the person rather than the argument, right? And normally in philosophy, we just don't truck with this. We say, well, forget it. It's irrelevant whether or not Peter Singer lives up to his own standards. We have to deal with the argument, because consider, somebody could give a good argument and still be a hypocrite. That we're not interested in the hypocrisy of the person. We're interested in whether or not the argument itself is sound, right? I mean, if Bill Clinton says adultery is wrong, right? Bill Clinton has said something true, even though he's a hypocrite, right? Having committed adultery, right? So in philosophy, we're always interested in the argument rather than the person. Now, this an ad hominem argument. This question applied to Singer in this conversation has a little more teeth, though, because I think we are suspicious when he starts talking about the point of marginal utility. We're suspicious not just that Singer isn't living up to his own standards, but rather it's a reasonable question: can anybody live like this? Can anybody live up to this standard that he's proposing, right? So 2 replies to that. In the first case, to the issue of Singer himself, by all accounts, he gives a lot of money to. By all accounts, the answer is yes. He gives as much money as he can to live up to this standard and to help people in distressed countries around the world. To help, he gives a lot of money to charitable organizations. Oxfam is his charity of choice. So, I mean, he himself, he of course has dealt with this question over and over again. Singer, by the way, I should point out, is maybe one of the most visible philosophers in the world. He's a celebrity philosopher. There are celebrity philosophers. Now that you know his name and you've heard of him, he's getting a little old now, but he used to be on a lot of talk shows. Every few years he would write a book, either on this topic or about animal welfare. That's his other big issue. And to promote his book, he would make the rounds of the usual talk shows. He was on Stephen Colbert once, way back when. He was on the Bill Maher. He used to be on the Bill Maher show pretty regularly. So he's present in pop culture. Keep an eye out for him. As I said, he's an older man now. He's a really tall Australian dude. And he's either going to be talking about how much money you should be giving to charity, or he's going to be talking about how all animals are morally equal. And we should be as upset about the killing of a cow as we are about the killing of a person. My other point in reply to the question of whether or not anybody lives up to the standard is about 10 years ago, Singer published a book called The Life You Can Save, available on Amazon if you want to look it up. And The Life You Can Save, in addition to reiterating some of the arguments that he makes in Famine, Affluence, and Morality, The Life You Can Save has a series of case studies of real people who live up to something close to this standard, right? People, for instance, there's a Wall Street stockbroker who commutes by train like 90 minutes one way each day. He lives like up in a small studio apartment like in Yonkers, and works like a fanatic, works 70, 80 hours a week, makes a lot of money, makes $1 million a year, but takes the vast majority of that money and packages up and donates it to certain charities, right? Doesn't go out to eat, doesn't own a car, doesn't have any of these sort of doesn't have the flashy lifestyle that his coworkers have. Rather, he is using all his money to save lives, right? And a big point of the book is, hey, aren't these people miserable? People who live up to this standard, aren't they totally miserable? Because I think I'd be miserable if all of my money were just spent to go off to benefit some stranger, right? But the point of Singer's book is, well, no, these people aren't miserable. And the misery that we imagine suffering because of having to live up to this standard is maybe just a function of the propaganda of our consumerist culture. Singer argues at length in that book that these people's lives aren't far from being miserable. These people they're doing something. They're living up. They're creating something beyond themselves. They're living for a reason besides just shoveling greasy food down their face and buying the big next thing to show off to their friends. They're actually saving lives, and their lives are better off in most ways, because they are concentrated on values that are deep and fulfilling, rather than just blowing their money on a lot of disposable distractions. That said, in recent years, Singer has backed off a little bit, quite a bit actually, of the marginal utility standard. He thinks that that's probably too much to ask of people to practice en masse. So he's backed off of that in the last couple of decades, and what he says now is 30%. 30% is the amount he thinks that any American willing to downsize his or her lifestyle, 30% ought to be the amount that you can sacrifice without having to live in squalor, without having to live a life that's not worth living. Now, 30% is going to hurt, right? I mean, you're going to feel it, but the little bit of pain that is caused by you having to downsize your life, Singer says, is going to be offset by the lives that are saved, right? You having to go without a new laptop or a new car, that's going to cause a little bit of pain, but consider that the money that you would have spent on that is going to actually save the lives of a child somewhere around the world. That some child is going to eat for the next month because of your sacrifice, right? Now, it is at this point that it should be clear that Singer is a utilitarian. He is, right? That argument right there is very utilitarian, and that's by design. The idea that the little bit of pain that that's being caused to you, or that you're taking on, is going to redound to the benefit of more happiness points for somebody else, and that for now there's no other way to do it, so you have a moral obligation to do it, right? And Singer thinks that this attitude is going to upend. It's going to make a lot of trouble for our usual moral categories, right? We often talk about the difference between charity and duty, right? A duty is something that we have a positive moral obligation to do. It's wrong if we don't do it, right? Whereas a charitable act is something that is, it's often called in philosophy, because we like to give things long and sonorous names, it's a charitable act is sometimes called a supererogatory act. That is, it is above and beyond the call of duty. That a charitable action, a supererogatory act, is an act that it is good to do, but not wrong if you don't do it, right? And so we commonly think of there being this distinction between charity and duty. You have, for instance, a duty to feed your own children and take care of your own children's needs. But it's charitable if you spend your extra money to help somebody else's kids around the world, right? And Singer realizes and fully accepts the fact that, well, his argument is going to really rock the boat, if not sink the boat, with regards to those moral categories. That actually a great deal of the things that we normally think of as being charitable actions, he says, are going to turn out, because of that principle, they're going to turn out to be moral duties. That it's not good to give to help save the children, but not wrong if you don't do it. It's good to do it, and it's just as bad as killing them if you don't do it, right? He doesn't see any distinction really between killing Kitty Genovese or allowing Kitty Genovese to die. He doesn't see any difference between killing those Syrian orphans and knowing you can help those Syrian orphans, but just allowing them to die. If the result because he's a utilitarian, if the result is the same, if the result is these children died and the death was preventable, then there's blood on the hands of the people who could have helped as much as there is on the hands of the people who actually killed them or actually starved them. Now, that brings us to another point. What about the people who are actually starving those children around the world? We know that the places where there are a lot of social problems and a lot of poverty and a lot of famine very often are in places that are undergoing some sort of political upheaval, right? either a civil war or maybe the aftermath of a civil war where somebody is taken over and is actively starving some part of the population that maybe was on the wrong side of the civil war a few years ago. Maybe, Syrian refugee crisis, we have a major civil war in Syria, and then the people flee because they don't want to get blown up. They flee to other countries, and the other countries don't have a way to really deal with them except by putting them in these big camps where then they're at the mercy of people who want to go into those camps and take care of them, right? The other countries have donated the space, but those other countries maybe don't have the resources to actually feed another million people in addition to their own people, right? So political problems, political crises tend to cause these kinds of problems around the world. And of course, political crises tend to be caused by and encouraged by bad political actors, by dictators, by terrorist groups, and so on, right? And in a lot of cases, it is those dictators and those terrorist groups who are responsible for starving a lot of these people. And that leads a lot of people like you and me to say, well, yeah, okay, I would love to give to save the children, but how do I know my money is actually going to reach them, right? If I just give my money to, if I just write a check to try to help the kids who are in, having a lot of trouble in Sudan, for instance, how do I know that my money is actually getting to the poor children of Sudan, but not being cut off of the path and redirected to some local warlord who's in charge of that neck of the woods and doesn't want those kids to survive because he's engaged in some sort of ethnic cleansing campaign, right? How do I know my money's getting where it's going? And if it isn't getting where it's going, how do I know it's not actually making the problem worse, right? Now, Singer, of course, thinks this is a really good question because from his utilitarian perspective, if you were going to spend $500 on a PlayStation, but instead you're going to donate it, instead you're going to make that sacrifice. You're going to donate $500 instead to some charitable organization. And that $500 ends up being blown on, some warlord somewhere building a gold toilet or something, right? Or worse yet, buying more rifles for his militia. Then Singer says, well, yeah, okay, you'd be better off just buying a PlayStation back in the U.S., right? I mean, the PlayStation is going to bring you some joy, right, as opposed to giving more money to this evil warlord, right? But that's not your only option, Singer points out. I mean, the truth of the matter is that there are lots and lots of charitable organizations that have very, very good reputations, that are very transparent about how their money is spent. And if you concentrate on giving the money to those charitable organizations, for instance, Oxfam, then Singer says there's no need to worry that your money is going to end up lining the pockets of some vicious warlord. This requires a little bit of research, of course. Singer is happy to help out with that research. There are a few charities that he endorses, and he gives sort of a stamp of approval to. And so he thinks there's in the end no real excuse. I mean, you have to be careful, and this happens, 10 years ago when there was the giant earthquake in Haiti. Haiti is a society that is very, very, very poor and isn't great at taking care of the poorest people in the society. I mean, there are some well-to-do people. Obviously, there are a lot of well-to-do people in Haiti, but there are also a lot of people who live in totally abject, desperate poverty, right? And so, the earthquake. There was an earthquake there about 10 years ago, and these people, it affected, of course, the least well-off the most. It affected the poorest people in the society. I mean, you have kids packed into these, very poor Haitian orphanages, and all of a sudden they have debris falling on their head, right? So in the wake of that, you have back then you had a lot of little kind of mom and pop charities popping up, right? And especially on Twitter. Twitter made it really easy, like, oh yeah, donate $100 to my little Haitian relief fund, right? And you had to be careful about who you were giving your money to, because who knows where that money's going. If it's just Bob's Haitian Relief Fund, then for all you know, you're just helping Bob, right? So in those kinds of times, it's most important to not buy into any sort of hype or propaganda, but to concentrate on donating to the aid organizations that have the best reputation. And Singer thinks that there's no excuse not to, right? So, give me just a second. Okay, a couple more issues related to Singer. Well, one more, and then we're going to talk about ways that people have replied to Singer's argument. One thing that often comes up in discussions about Singer, questions that my students often ask, goes this way. Well, don't we have a moral obligation to help the kids who are starving and impoverished here in the United States before we turn our attentions to, Sudan or Syria or someplace around the world like that? And normally in class, then I will ask that question or allow that question to be asked, and then put it to the class. Well, what do you think, right? Because in a word, no. Singer thinks, no, we do not have more of an obligation to kids in the United States than we do to kids around the world. They're human beings. They are experiencers of pleasure and pain and death. And Singer thinks that we have a moral obligation to the people who are the worst off. You have to help the worst off first. And the worst off, Singer takes it, are not generally found in the United States or any of the more advanced affluent countries around the world. Here you hear for the example I give in class is, and I'm going to tread lightly here because I don't mean to pick on Haiti, okay? And I've gotten into trouble with some Haitians in my class for continuing to sort of pick on Haiti as being a real impoverished country, because a few years ago, Donald Trump made some extremely unkind comments about Haiti, right? But this is just a true story. So go back to the 10 years ago in the earthquake in Haiti, right? Around that time, I heard there were on NPR they were doing an interview with some missionaries who worked in Haiti, some American missionaries who were going down there and trying to help out, like before the earthquake, and they told stories about how in the worst, most impoverished orphanages down there. These orphanages are just overcrowded and they're packed, and the kids are not getting nearly the resources they need, and a lot of them are literally starving, right? And they told stories about how kids down there would commonly, eat mud to feel full, right? Since I've told this story in class, I've heard from a lot of other people from other places around the world that suffer poverty. Some of my students have said, yeah, when I was little, I've eaten mud, right? So I'm not picking on Haiti or any other country in the world for that matter. I'm just pointing out that is a different kind of poverty than we are used to here in the United States. When we are talking about poverty here in the United States, as bad as it is, we're talking about kids who are eating a couple times a week, right? Not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's acceptable. I'm not saying there shouldn't be some way for those kids to find food. But often, especially when you hear about cutting school lunches, you hear about how, well, there are kids in the United States who that's the only time they eat during the day, right? Not good. But compare those cases to cases in other countries where kids are eating 0 times a week, where they're eating only what they can find, what they can scrounge up to the forest, or what they can beg off the street. Right, those cases are worse from Singer's perspective. I think he's got a point here, right? So we need to take care of the most extreme cases first. That we need to take care of the cases where there is the most amount of suffering first, and then work our way back to the less bad cases, right? You don't remodel your house while your roof is on fire. You got to put the fire out on your roof, and then worry about how you how you remodel your basement, right? Okay. Now, let's turn to the question about, well, what is about the legacy of Singer and the way that people have replied to him. Now, Singer's article, as I said, has been very, very well anthologized. It's been widely read. Lots of people have given replies to it. Probably the best, most straightforward reply that I've read is actually in this edition of the book. It's by Timmerman. It comes right immediately following Singer's article. A lot of people have tried to reply to Singer by just pointing out that they don't like the political results of his argument. That, well, there could be some bad results of just giving too much money to impoverished nations around the world, right? Which is possibly true. And actually, we're going to talk about one of the people who would make that kind of argument next. But none of that replies to the core of Singer's argument. And the core of Singer's argument is the drowning baby example, right? If you're going to give a reply to Singer, you have to give a direct reply to why it is that we don't have a moral obligation to help the baby, despite our common sense, or why it is that our intuitions about helping the drowning baby don't map onto our intuitions to help Syrian orphans or Haitian orphans or so on, right? And Timmerman's article, I invite you to read it. I'll give a short synopsis of it here. Timmerman's reply is that, well, the drowning baby argument is just that Singer doesn't quite spell out all of the details that are going to be relevant to making the transfer, right? Like the drowning baby example presupposes there's one drowning baby, that helping the drowning baby requires virtually no sacrifice on your account, and that drowning babies generally are anomalous events. That is, they don't happen very often, right? And Timmerman points out if we change the example to not just one baby, but 1,000 drowning babies, and you having to clear out your bank account every day to help just a few of those drowning babies, right? Then maybe our intuitions about what your moral obligations are going to change a little bit, right? Singer's argument presupposes that there is not too much change in your lifestyle that is going to be required to help the drowning baby. But then later on, when he's talking about children, dying in East Timor, he's more than happy to say, "Oh yeah, but it means it's going to require massively changing your lifestyle." And Timmerman points out that that's maybe there's a shell game going on there, right? Maybe that's a reason to be suspicious of the transfer of the drowning baby to the real-world starving child, right? In any case, what we are going to be talking about next is we are going to be talking about the writings of, or an article from Garrett Hardin. And you can think of Garrett Hardin as sort of the opposite of Peter Singer. He's the anti-Singer. Whereas Singer thought that we need to be helping people around the world, Hardin makes arguments that no, actually by helping people around the world, we just make their problems worse. And we should concentrate only on maintaining the status quo for ourselves here in the affluent countries, right? So, okay, I invite you to check that out. And just a disclaimer before we read Garrett Hardin, don't take the fact that he's on my syllabus. Don't assume that I endorse his views. The views of Garrett Hardin do not necessarily represent the views of the teacher of this class. But Garrett Hardin is he's a very well-known philosopher, or he's dead now. Very well-known philosopher and very influential, and very relevant to the discussion, right? So the issue that he's going to be concentrating on is overpopulation and immigration. So, okay, I will talk to you later on then.